The boardroom had the kind of silence that forms before disasters, the air dense with unspoken accusations and corporate dread. Victoria Sinclair stood at the head of the mahogany table, her tailored navy suit sharp enough to cut her expression controlled, in the way only a 34-year-old CEO who'd clawed her way through 18 months of hostile board politics could manage. 6 directors sat arrayed before her like a tribunal, their faces ranging from skeptical to openly hostile, while Richard Ashford occupied the chair to her right with the calm of a man who believed himself untouchable. I've called this emergency meeting to address what I believe is systematic financial fraud and intellectual property theft occurring at the highest levels of this company. Victoria's voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone delivering a quarterly earnings report, not the opening salvo of institutional warfare. The evidence suggests a pattern of embezzlement totaling $8.7 million over 3 years executed through shell consulting companies and falsified vendor contracts. Richard's expression didn't flicker, which should have been Victoria's first warning. Instead, he leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who'd prepared for this moment, his salt and pepper hair catching the recessed lighting in a way that made him look distinguished rather than cornered. Those are serious allegations, Victoria. I assume you have documentation to support claims of this magnitude. His tone carried just enough concern to sound reasonable, just enough skepticism to plant doubt. Before Victoria could respond, the conference room door opened. The man who entered wore a charcoal suit that looked expensive enough to belong in this space, his posture upright and deliberate, his dark brown skin a sharp contrast to the room's usual homogeneity. He carried a leather document folder under one arm and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where he belonged, even when everything about the room's reaction suggested otherwise. Security removed this man. Victoria's words came out sharper than she'd intended, the autopilot of executive authority kicking in before her brain could process what her eyes were seeing. The intruder is Marcus Brooks. He was terminated 3 weeks ago for cause. Marcus stopped at the edge of the table, his gaze sweeping across the board members with methodical precision before settling on Victoria. His voice, when it came, carried none of the deference she remembered from their single confrontation. I wasn't terminated, Ms. Sinclair. I resigned. There's a difference, though. I understand why you might not have noticed. The board chair, Otis Brennan, a man whose 70 years sat heavy in his jowls and impatient in his eyes, made a gesture of dismissal. This is highly irregular. Victoria, handle your personnel issues on your own time. Marcus set the folder on the table with a sound like a gavel. I'm not here as personnel. I'm here as a witness to federal crimes. And before anyone calls security again, you should know that the FBI has had this building under surveillance for 6 months. Special Agent Williams is currently 3 floors down executing a search warrant on the finance department. So we can either have this conversation here privately, or we can have it on the 6 o'clock news with federal marshals in attendance. The silence that followed felt like falling. 3 months earlier, the apartment building on Ashland Avenue had seen better decades, its brick facade weathered to the color of old blood, its hallways carrying the permanent smell of cooking oil and an industrial cleaner, and lives lived too close together. Marcus Brooks moved through the pre-dawn darkness of his 2-bedroom unit with the efficiency of a man whose schedule allowed no wasted motion, his 6-foot frame navigating furniture placement memorized through repetition rather than sight. The bills sat on the kitchen counter in their usual formation, arranged by due date, like soldiers awaiting orders. Rent $847 to due in 6 days. Electric $156 past due by 11 days, with a disconnect warning stamped in red. Maya's migraine medication refill $680 insurance coverage denied for the 3rd consecutive month, with an appeal pending that would take 45 to 60 business days to process. The bank statement clinging to the refrigerator door via an alphabet magnet shaped like the letter M showed a balance of $73.18. Marcus had learned not to look at these numbers too long. They were facts immutable as gravity, and staring at them changed nothing except his ability to sleep. The photo on the nightstand caught the first gray light filtering through the window blinds. Sarah Brooks smiled out from the frame, her natural hair pulled back in the twist she'd favored, her brown eyes warm with the kind of joy that existed before illness rewrote the rules. The caption beneath, written in Sarah's careful handwriting during one of her last good weeks, read, "Love is bigger than the sky. Tell Maya every day." The date stamp showed June 2022, 4 years and 2 months ago, 3 weeks before a drunk driver had turned a Tuesday afternoon into the last time Marcus heard his wife's laugh. Maya's note, written in the careful print of a 7-year-old trying very hard to spell correctly, sat tucked into the corner of the same frame. Daddy, you are my hero. Love is bigger than the sky, and the misspellings made his chest tighter than the bills ever could. He packed her lunch with the precision of someone who'd done this calculation 1,000 times, distributing the week's grocery budget across 5 days of meals that had to provide adequate nutrition without looking like poverty to the other children. Peanut butter sandwich on wheat bread, apple slices in a sandwich bag, carrot sticks. The granola bar he'd wanted to include stayed in the pantry because the box had to last another 4 days, and Maya's breakfast tomorrow required 2. The night shift janitor uniform hung on the back of the bathroom door, the navy blue polyester carrying the sharp chemical smell of industrial cleaner that no amount of washing could fully eliminate. Marcus had worn it for 3 years, ever since the restructuring that had transformed him from senior systems engineer with a salary of $118,000 into night maintenance technician, earning $34,000 plus benefits. The benefits mattered more than the salary, specifically the health insurance that covered Maya's neurologist appointments every 6 weeks and the medication that kept her migraines from stealing entire days of her childhood. He'd signed the non-disclosure agreement because saying no meant losing everything. Richard Ashford had been very clear about that during their meeting in the HR conference room, his voice carrying the kind of reasonableness that made threats sound like advice. We're restructuring to align roles with current market demands. Your engineering position is being eliminated, but we value your technical knowledge. We can offer you a maintenance position with full benefits, continuation, provided you sign this agreement, waiving any claims regarding intellectual property authorship or compensation. The alternative, of course, is severance, which would terminate your benefits immediately. Marcus had thought about Sarah's medical bills, still outstanding at the time, totaling $68,000 that bankruptcy wouldn't eliminate. He'd thought about Maya's diagnosis 3 months earlier, the neurologist's careful explanation that childhood migraines required consistent treatment and monitoring. He'd thought about the job market for Black engineers with a gap in their resume. The statistics he knew too well about employment discrimination, the reality that finding another position with equivalent benefits could take months he didn't have. He'd signed. The systems he'd designed still ran. The company's infrastructure still saved an estimated $12 million annually through predictive maintenance algorithms and optimized resource allocation. His name had been methodically stripped from every document, every presentation, every patent filing. The Predict AI platform that now generated 37% of the company's operational efficiency improvements carried the authorship credit finance innovation team in all official documentation. Marcus kept his own records, time-stamped code repositories on GitHub under a pseudonym, email chains saved to a personal encrypted server, design documents with his digital signature embedded in metadata that most people didn't know how to check. For 3 years, he'd maintained this archive not out of some plan for eventual vindication, but because documentation felt like the only form of resistance available to a man who'd traded his professional identity for his daughter's medical care. The phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m., jerking him from the rhythm of mopping the executive floor. The school's number lit the screen with the particular dread that lived in every single parent's nervous system. Mr. Brooks, this is Nurse Patterson at Lincoln Elementary. Maya's fine, but she had another migraine episode during after-school care. We've been trying to reach you for 20 minutes. The supervisor's office sat dark and empty. The building's skeleton crew spread too thin to notice one janitor's absence. Marcus changed into street clothes in the maintenance closet, his hands moving through the familiar sequence, while his mind calculated distances and timing. 40-minute bus ride to Maya's school, another hour back to the apartment. He'd missed the last 2 hours of his shift, which would trigger an attendance point under the new disciplinary system Richard had implemented 6 months ago. 3 points in a 90-day period meant termination. He already had 2 points both from previous times Maya had needed him during work hours. Maya sat in the nurse's office with an ice pack pressed to her forehead, her gap-toothed smile appearing the moment she saw him, despite the obvious pain creasing her small face. Her hair, sectioned into neat twists that morning, had come loose on one side from where she'd been lying down. "Hey, baby girl." Marcus knelt to her eye level, his voice dropping into the gentle register he saved for moments, when his daughter needed to know the world wasn't as hard as it felt. Rough day. My head hurt really bad, and the lights were too bright, and I couldn't remember my times tables even though I studied. Her voice carried the particular frustration of a child who'd been working very hard at something that should have been simple. But I didn't cry in front of anyone. You always say being brave doesn't mean not being scared, it means doing the hard thing anyway. Marcus felt something crack behind his ribs, the foundation of whatever pride he had left shifting under the weight of having raised a daughter who'd learned stoicism at 7 because life had demanded it. That's exactly right. You're the bravest person I know. The neurologist's last recommendation had been to try a newer medication, one the insurance company classified as non-formulary and therefore not covered under the standard plan. The prior authorization appeal sat in some bureaucratic queue, awaiting review by people who'd never met Maya, and never would people for whom her migraines were a line item in a cost-benefit analysis rather than a 7-year-old's stolen afternoons. The data center alarm triggered at 2:37 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of cascade failure that turned minor malfunctions into catastrophic system crashes if not addressed within minutes. Marcus reached the basement server room before the automated notifications could wake anyone from the day shift IT department, his hands already moving through emergency protocols while his mind mapped the problem across physical and digital infrastructure. Smoke detector activation in cooling system zone 3. Temperature climbing past safety thresholds in server racks, housing the financial database and customer transaction systems. 6 minutes until automatic shutdown protocols would trigger, taking with them approximately $6 million in transaction processing capacity and rendering the company's primary revenue stream inoperable until full system restoration. The cooling unit's compressor had seized a failure Marcus traced to deferred maintenance on a component he'd flagged for replacement 4 months earlier. His recommendation had been noted in the maintenance log and then promptly ignored because the part cost $1,800 and Richard's latest efficiency initiative had frozen all non-emergency equipment expenditures. Marcus bypassed the failed compressor through a manual override that required crawling behind the server racks with nothing but his phone's flashlight and 15 years of engineering experience. The fix was temporary, good for maybe 72 hours before the system would need proper repair, but it prevented the immediate crisis and saved the company from a disaster that would have made the morning news. He documented the failure, the cause, the temporary solution, and the urgency of permanent repair in a detailed email sent to the facilities manager at 3:21 a.m. By 9 o'clock the next morning, when Victoria Sinclair arrived at her office and checked the overnight incident reports, she'd see a 2-sentence summary: minor cooling system issue resolved by IT, no customer impact, normal operations continuing. She'd never know Marcus's name had been anywhere near the solution. The executive elevator had trapped 6 people between the 9th and 10th floors at 4:15 on a Thursday afternoon, including Victoria and 3 potential investors whose multi-million-dollar commitment depended on their perception of the company's operational competence. The elevator's emergency phone connected them to building security, who connected them to facilities who spent 12 minutes trying to troubleshoot the problem remotely before admitting they had no idea what was wrong. Marcus heard the distress call over the maintenance radio while restocking cleaning supplies on the 7th floor. The elevator system was old enough to predate modern safety redundancies, which meant a stuck car could stay stuck for hours if the brake release mechanism had jammed. He'd studied the system's schematics during his first month in the engineering department, back when learning every detail of the building's infrastructure had felt like professional development rather than survival preparation. The shaft access panel sat behind a locked maintenance door that Marcus had keys for, but wasn't technically authorized to use without supervisor approval. Requesting approval would take 20 minutes minimum, during which Victoria and her investors would be calling their lawyers, their board members, their contacts at competing firms who'd love to hear about this operational disaster. Marcus opened the panel and climbed. The elevator car sat 18 feet below him, close enough that he could hear the voices through the ceiling grate. Someone, probably Victoria, based on the tone of controlled frustration, was explaining that these incidents were extremely rare and certainly not reflective of standard operations. Someone else, probably one of the investors, based on the skeptical response, was asking whether other aspects of the company's infrastructure were similarly well maintained. The brake mechanism had indeed jammed, a failure Marcus cleared in 90 seconds by manually releasing the electromagnetic lock and resetting the safety catch. The elevator lurched back into motion with a mechanical groan that probably did nothing to reassure the passengers, but they were moving, which was all that mattered. Marcus was back in the maintenance closet, washing gear oil off his hands by the time Victoria and her investors stepped out into the 10th floor lobby. He heard her voice through the stairwell door, bright with relief and professional composure, restored, assuring everyone that the building management would be conducting a full investigation. The facilities report filed the next day credited the resolution to standard emergency protocols and building management response. David Sullivan, the chief operating officer, who'd briefly glimpsed Marcus climbing down from the shaft, said nothing to correct this narrative. He filed the observation away in the growing collection of things he'd noticed about the company's operations that didn't match the official story. The Japanese investors arrived at 10 a.m. for a demonstration that would determine whether the company secured a $15 million contract or watched it go to a competitor. The presentation room had been prepared with obsessive attention to detail, every element choreographed to showcase the company's technical capabilities and market positioning. Richard Ashford would be delivering the pitch supported by carefully designed slides and a live demonstration of the Predict AI system. Marcus was cleaning the hallway outside when the first sign of disaster emerged in the form of Richard's assistant sprinting toward the IT department with the kind of panic that preceded very expensive failures. The projection system had died 45 seconds before the presentation was scheduled to begin, taking with it all the carefully prepared demonstrations and leaving Richard standing in front of 5 politely skeptical Japanese executives with nothing but his natural charm. Marcus heard about the crisis through the building's maintenance radio chatter, the frantic back and forth between IT staff who'd been summoned from their morning coffee to fix a problem they hadn't caused and didn't understand. He set down the industrial vacuum and moved toward the presentation room with the deliberate calm of someone who already knew what had gone wrong and how to fix it. The projection system's control board sat in a recessed panel behind the podium, accessible only to someone who knew where to look and had the security credentials to open it. Marcus had installed the original system 6 years ago, back when his engineering role included responsibility for conference room technology and infrastructure. The current failure stemmed from a blown circuit board in the signal processor, a component that should have been replaced during routine maintenance, but hadn't been because Richard's cost-cutting measures had eliminated routine maintenance. Marcus crawled behind the presentation stage, while Richard kept the investors occupied with increasingly desperate small talk about market conditions and strategic synergies. The signal processor could be bypassed if you knew which cables to reroute and which settings to manually override in the backup system. Marcus knew because he'd designed the redundancy protocol specifically for scenarios like this. 90 seconds after he started working, the projection system flickered back to life. Richard's presentation slides appeared on the screen with perfect clarity, the demonstration cue loaded and ready. Marcus slipped out through the service entrance before anyone could see him, leaving behind only the faint smell of solder and the evidence of emergency repairs that would be discovered and puzzled over later. The presentation succeeded. The contract was signed. Victoria personally thanked the IT department for their quick response to an unforeseen technical issue, never knowing that the person who'd saved the company's single largest deal of the quarter was currently mopping the bathroom on the 3rd floor. The restaurant was called Marchand's, the kind of establishment where reservations required 3 weeks' notice and wine poured by the glass cost more than Marcus spent on groceries in a week. Victoria occupied a corner table with Otis Brennan and 3 potential investors, the conversation flowing around topics of market positioning and growth capital and strategic acquisitions that would dilute her control while expanding the company's reach. She saw Marcus before he saw her, the recognition hitting in 3 distinct waves of cognitive dissonance. The first wave was simple surprise, the jarring displacement of seeing someone profoundly out of their expected context. The night janitor who emptied her office trash and cleaned the executive bathroom did not belong at Marchand's on a Tuesday evening, wearing a charcoal suit that, while not custom-tailored, fit well enough to suggest intentional purchase rather than thrift store luck. The second wave was something closer to offense, the territorial response of someone whose mental map of social hierarchy had just been disrupted. Marchand's was her space, the domain of people who held power and made decisions and shaped the world through capital allocation. The man who cleaned her office belonged to a different category, a different sphere, and his presence here violated the implicit boundaries that kept those spheres separate. The third wave was something she didn't have a name for yet. Something that felt uncomfortably like attraction, mixed with jealousy, mixed with the dawning realization that she knew absolutely nothing about this person beyond his job title and his tendency to request schedule accommodations. Marcus sat across from a woman whose elegance had the particular quality of someone who'd earned rather than inherited her sophistication. She leaned close, speaking in tones too low for Victoria to hear her expression, serious but not cold. Marcus listened with complete attention, nodding at something she said, his posture relaxed in a way Victoria had never seen during their single interaction at the office. The woman handed Marcus a document from her briefcase. He read it carefully, his expression shifting through a sequence Victoria couldn't interpret. When he looked up, he said something that made the woman smile, not with pleasure, but with the grim satisfaction of someone who'd just had their suspicions confirmed. Victoria caught fragments of their conversation during a lull in her own table's discussion, just enough to hear the woman say something about tomorrow and signing papers and Richard having nowhere to hide. The words made no sense in any context Victoria could construct, but they lodged in her mind with the weight of unfinished business questions that would need answering. Marcus's gaze swept across the restaurant during a pause in his conversation, landing on Victoria for perhaps 2 seconds. His expression didn't change, didn't register surprise or concern or embarrassment. He simply acknowledged her presence the way one might acknowledge a stranger in a public space, neither friendly nor hostile, and then returned his attention to the woman across from him. Victoria was the one who looked away first, a fact that bothered her more than the entire situation warranted. She called Diane Cooper on the drive home, the city lights blurring past the car windows, while her mind tried to solve the puzzle of Marcus Brooks eating at Marchand's with a woman who looked like she billed legal fees by the quarter hour. Find out everything you can about the night janitor Marcus Brooks, who he associates with, what he does outside work, anything unusual. Victoria kept her voice neutral, professional, the request framed as due diligence rather than the territorial investigation it actually was. Diane's response came with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd built a career on managing narratives and controlling information flow. I'll have something for you by morning. Any particular areas of concern? Just comprehensive background. Nothing urgent. The lie sat easier than admitting she had no idea why this mattered, only that it did. The report arrived via encrypted email at 7:43 the next morning. Marcus Brooks, 36 years old, widower, father to one daughter, age 7. Current employment, night shift maintenance technician, 3 years. Previous employment with the company, senior systems engineer, hired in 2018, promoted to lead systems architect in 2020, demoted to maintenance technician in 23 following organizational restructuring. Reason for demotion listed as position elimination and skills realignment. The restructuring documentation carried Richard Ashford's signature and the notation that Brooks had signed a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement as a condition of continued employment with benefits preservation. The specifics of that NDA were redacted from the file, accessible only with CFO override credentials. Diane's summary included one additional detail that hadn't appeared in any official documentation. The woman Marcus had been dining with was Jessica Monroe, a corporate attorney specializing in securities litigation and shareholder rights disputes. Her firm represented minority shareholders in hostile takeover attempts and had a track record of exposing executive malfeasance through forensic accounting and whistleblower testimony. Victoria stared at that final paragraph for a long time, her mind assembling implications like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. A demoted engineer dining with a securities litigator. A man who'd once earned 6 figures now cleaning toilets for $34,000 a year. A non-disclosure agreement whose contents required the chief financial officer's personal approval to access. She made the call that would change everything, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who believed she understood the situation when she understood almost nothing. Have Marcus Brooks report to my office this afternoon at 3. Tell him it's regarding his employment status and that attendance is mandatory. The conference room carried the sterile neutrality of corporate spaces designed for difficult conversations, its glass walls frosted for privacy, while still broadcasting the fact that something significant was happening behind them. Victoria arrived 10 minutes early, a tactical choice meant to establish dominance through prior occupation of territory. David Sullivan sat to her left as witness and operational conscience, his presence requested by HR protocol. Sharon Hayes occupied the seat to her right with a folder thick enough to suggest this meeting had a paper trail. Marcus entered at precisely 3 o'clock, his maintenance uniform replaced by slacks and a button-down shirt that looked worn but clean. He carried nothing except his phone, which he set face down on the table with the deliberate motion of someone who'd prepared for this moment. Victoria opened with the directness of someone who believed she held all the leverage. I need you to explain your relationship with Jessica Monroe. She's an attorney. Marcus's voice carried no inflection, no defensive edge, just a flat statement of fact. Representing whom exactly? Victoria leaned forward slightly, the posture of interrogation rather than conversation. Shareholders concerned about financial irregularities. His gaze stayed level, meeting her eyes without challenge but also without deference. The shift in Victoria's expression from confidence to irritation happened fast enough that David noticed. Are you providing her with confidential company information? I'm providing documentation of theft. 3 years of intellectual property stolen from me and credited to people who didn't create it. Marcus pulled a flash drive from his pocket and set it on the table between them, like evidence at a trial. Every project I designed, every system I built, every innovation that saved this company millions in operational costs. Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. Section 1832 makes economic espionage a crime. I'm not the thief in this scenario. Sharon's pen stopped moving across her notepad, the silence stretching long enough to become uncomfortable. David's posture shifted, his weight redistributing in his chair in the way of someone whose attention had just been captured completely. Victoria felt the ground beneath her assumptions beginning to crack, but couldn't stop the momentum of her planned confrontation. Those are serious accusations. What proof do you have beyond your word? The flash drive contains time-stamped code repositories, designed documents with my digital signature embedded in metadata email chains showing my original submissions and the altered versions crediting work to Richard Ashford's finance innovation team. Marcus spoke with the precision of someone who'd practiced this explanation, who'd known this moment would come eventually. The Predict AI system alone generates $12 million in annual savings. I wrote every line of that code. My name appears nowhere in the patent filing. Victoria's chest tightened with something that felt like falling. The sensation of discovering solid ground had been nothing but painted canvas all along. Why didn't you report this through proper channels? I did. 3 years ago. Sharon has the complaint in her files marked unsubstantiated and closed without investigation. The authorization to dismiss it came from Richard Ashford, the same person who demoted me from senior systems architect to night janitor after I refused to sign over intellectual property rights I'd never agreed to surrender. Sharon spoke for the first time since the meeting began, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of someone who'd been waiting years to say these words. That's accurate. The original complaint file was locked with CFO override access. I kept a copy of the unredacted version. The betrayal Victoria felt in that moment had layers, starting with Sharon's apparent conspiracy against management and drilling down into the realization that her own chief financial officer had been operating a parallel system of control she'd never noticed. You should have brought this to me directly. Marcus's laugh came out sharp and bitter. Nothing like humor. You didn't know my name until you saw me at a restaurant. You've walked past me cleaning your office for 3 years without once making eye contact. What part of our professional relationship suggested you'd listen if I told you your CFO was a criminal? The words landed like a physical blow, accurate enough to strip away Victoria's defenses and leave her exposed to the truth of her own willful blindness. Her response came out harder than she'd intended, pride masking as authority, because acknowledging the validity of his criticism would require dismantling the entire framework of how she understood her own leadership. Your position here has been accommodated extensively. Flexible scheduling, direct access to facilities management, continuation of benefits despite significant salary reduction. If you're dissatisfied with the terms of your employment, you're free to seek opportunities elsewhere. Marcus reached into his other pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, the motion unhurried and deliberate. The letter sat on the table between them, typed and signed, the formality of it suggesting premeditation rather than impulse. You never knew who I was. Now you want to dictate how I live. His voice stayed quiet, but something in his posture had shifted. The invisible weight of accommodation and survival finally set down after 3 years of carrying it. I've saved this company more times than you've bothered to notice. I fixed the data center while you slept. I cleared that jammed elevator with your investors trapped inside. I made your Japanese presentation work 60 seconds before it would have failed. And you never once asked my name until you needed to control me. The resignation letter sat between them like an indictment. David found his voice quiet but urgent. Victoria, you're making a mistake. Victoria's pride wouldn't let her back down, not with witnesses present, not with the architecture of her authority already crumbling. The meeting is concluded. HR will process your resignation and arrange final payment within the standard time frame. Marcus stood, his movement economical and final. He picked up his phone but left the flash drive on the table, a piece of evidence now entered into the record whether Victoria wanted it or not. By the time you figure out what you've lost, it'll be too late to fix. The door closed behind him with a sound like a cell locking. The first system failure alert arrived at 4:37 a.m. the following morning, pulling Victoria from sleep with the particular electronic urgency that preceded genuine disasters. The data center's cooling redundancy had failed, triggering temperature warnings across critical server arrays. By 5 a.m., the warehouse inventory management system had crashed, taking with it the ability to process or ship orders. The email servers followed at 6:15, intermittent failures that made the company's primary communication infrastructure unreliable enough to damage client confidence. The acting IT director, a man named Robert Martinez, who'd spent his entire career maintaining, rather than designing systems, stood in Victoria's office at 7 a.m., looking like someone being asked to defuse a bomb whose manual was written in a language he didn't speak. We can't figure out what's wrong. The systems are interconnected in ways that aren't documented in any of our standard architecture diagrams. Martinez's frustration came through in the tight control of his voice, the barely suppressed panic of a professional who just discovered his expertise was inadequate. Marcus designed most of this infrastructure. He's the only one who understands how the redundancies interact, then bring in outside consultants, whatever it costs. Victoria's response came from the playbook of executive crisis management, the assumption that money could solve any problem if applied with sufficient force. We did. They've been here since 6. Their assessment is that without the original architect's documentation, full restoration could take weeks. Martinez pulled up a screen on his laptop showing a cascade diagram of failed dependencies, each node connected to 3 others in a web of complexity that looked more like art than engineering. This isn't just a technical failure. Somebody deliberately triggered these cascades in sequence. The access logs show credential usage at 11:47 p.m. Tuesday night, originating from a workstation in the finance department. The implications hit Victoria in waves. She reached for her phone, pulling up Richard Ashford's contact information before her conscious mind had fully processed what she was about to accuse him of. Richard answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the artificial brightness of someone who'd been awake for hours. "Victoria, I heard about the systems issues. Unfortunate timing right after that technician resigned. Makes you wonder whether he sabotaged something on his way out. The suggestion was too perfect, too ready, the kind of narrative that appears fully formed when someone's been preparing it in advance." Victoria's instinct, sharpened by 18 months of navigating board politics, recognized the shape of a preemptive defense. Access logs show the systems were accessed from your department Tuesday night. Care to explain that? The pause before Richard responded lasted 3 seconds too long. "I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. I'll have my team pull those records and get back to you." "Do that, and Richard, don't leave the building without talking to me first." Victoria ended the call before he could respond, the small act of control mattering more than the actual content of their exchange. Sharon arrived at Victoria's office at 8:30 with the folder she'd kept locked in her personal filing cabinet for 3 years, the contents protected by ethical obligations that had just been superseded by the need to prevent ongoing harm. The file's first page showed Marcus Brooks's original employment contract, hired in 2018 as senior systems engineer at a starting salary of $118,000 plus benefits and stock options. The second page documented his promotion to lead systems architect in 2020, salary increased to $142,000 with a performance review, noting his exceptional technical capabilities and innovative approach to infrastructure optimization. The Predict AI system proposal appeared on page 7, submitted March 15, 2021, bearing Marcus's digital signature and detailed technical specifications that would have taken months to develop. Page 12 showed the same project resubmitted June 8, 2021, authorship credited to Finance Innovation, team technical specifications, identical except for superficial formatting changes. The approval signature belonged to Richard Ashford. Victoria read through 47 pages of similar patterns, each one documenting a cycle of creation and theft that had been operating under her leadership for 3 years. The final document was the non-disclosure agreement. Marcus had signed its terms requiring him to waive all claims to intellectual property created during his employment in exchange for continued health insurance coverage and the preservation of his maintenance position. The leverage point was spelled out in Clause 7, subsection 3. Employee acknowledges that his dependent daughter requires ongoing medical treatment for chronic migraine disorder. Employee agrees that termination of employment for any reason, including voluntary resignation, will result in immediate cessation of all health benefits, with no COBRA continuation available due to cause of termination classification. They used his daughter's medical condition as a weapon. Sharon's voice carried the flat affect of someone who'd been professionally complicit in something that kept her awake at night. Richard presented it as a cost-saving measure, restructuring to eliminate redundant positions. "I processed the paperwork because refusing would have meant my own termination. But I kept the original file because I knew this was wrong." Victoria felt sick in a way that had nothing to do with her body and everything to do with the sudden clarity of her own moral failure. "I walked past him for 3 years. I didn't even know his daughter's name. Maya, 7 years old. Migraine medication costs $680 per month, not covered by insurance because it's classified as non-formulary. The prior authorization appeals take 60 days minimum and get denied 83% of the time. Sharon pulled out another sheet, this one showing Marcus's attendance records, with 2 points marked for early departures due to family medical emergencies. Richard's new disciplinary policy implemented 6 months ago terminates employees at 3 points in a 90-day period. The architecture of cruelty was meticulous, each piece designed to trap Marcus in a system where leaving meant his daughter suffered and staying meant accepting systematic erasure of his professional identity. Victoria understood power had wielded it with precision throughout her career, but this was something different. This was power turned sociopathic targeting, vulnerability with surgical accuracy. Lincoln Elementary School occupied a brick building in a neighborhood where property values reflected demographic sorting more honestly than any census data. Victoria arrived at 1:15 in response to a call from the principal, the stated reason being an incident involving Maya Brooks that required immediate parental or guardian presence. Marcus, the principal, had explained with careful neutrality couldn't be reached because his employment had recently terminated and his cell phone service had been disconnected for non-payment. Victoria had volunteered herself without fully understanding why the decision emerging from guilt and responsibility and something else she couldn't name yet. She found Maya sitting in the administrative office, her small frame curled into itself, her eyes red from crying, but her face composed with the particular stoicism of children who'd learned early that emotional display brought consequences. The teacher, a white woman in her 50s named Mrs. Patterson, explained the situation with the kind of concern that masked itself as neutrality. Maya scored 98% on today's science assessment, which is significantly above her usual performance range. Given the complexity of the questions and the sophistication of her answers, I felt it necessary to verify the work's authenticity. You accused her of cheating. Victoria kept her voice level, but something cold had entered the space between words. I raised questions about the possibility of unauthorized assistance, which is part of my professional responsibility, when student performance deviates substantially from established patterns. Mrs. Patterson's defensive posture suggested she'd had this conversation before and had prevailed through institutional inertia. Victoria looked at the test paper, its questions covering photosynthesis and cellular respiration and ecosystem dynamics at a level that seemed advanced for second grade. Maya's answers were written in careful print, each sentence constructed with the deliberate syntax of a child thinking hard about how to explain complex ideas. The final question asked students to describe how energy flows through an ecosystem. Maya had written, "The sun gives energy to plants, and plants give energy to animals when they eat them, and when animals die, they give energy back to the ground so new plants can grow. It's like a circle that never stops, and my dad says that's why we have to take care of everything because it's all connected." This is her own work. Victoria heard the certainty in her voice before she'd fully processed the reasoning behind it. The syntax, the specific phrasing, the reference to her father. This is how a 7-year-old who's been listening to someone who cares about science would express understanding. Mrs. Patterson's expression tightened. With respect, Ms. Sinclair students from certain backgrounds often require additional scrutiny to ensure academic integrity. The coded language landed like a slap, its meaning clear, despite the careful, neutral phrasing. Victoria felt something ignite in her chest, anger mixed with recognition, mixed with the shame of knowing she'd been complicit in these same systems of assumption and dismissal. Maya didn't cheat. She'll receive full credit for this assessment, and you'll issue a written apology that goes in her permanent file, clearing any suggestion of academic dishonesty. If I hear about any retaliation or bias in her future evaluations, I'll personally ensure the school board reviews your employment history for patterns of discriminatory behavior. The principal, who'd been silent through this exchange, made a small gesture of concession. "We'll handle this appropriately, Miss Sinclair. Thank you for your time." Victoria knelt to Maya's eye level once they'd left the administrative office, the hallway empty between class periods. "Your dad talks to you about science?" Maya nodded, her gap-toothed smile appearing for the first time since Victoria arrived. "He explains how everything works. He says being curious is the best thing a person can be, and questions are more important than answers sometimes." The apartment building looked worse in daylight, its structural decay more obvious without the softening effect of darkness. Victoria knocked on Marcus's door at 6 p.m., her professional armor left behind in favor of jeans and a sweater that felt like civilian clothes, like approaching as a person rather than a position. Marcus opened the door with the wariness of someone who'd learned that unexpected visitors brought problems rather than solutions. His expression shifted from guarded to confused when he recognized Victoria, the cognitive dissonance of seeing his former CEO standing in his hallway, evidently too strange to process immediately. Maya had an incident at school. A teacher accused her of cheating on a science test. Victoria watched his face change anger and fear and protective instinct, all appearing in rapid sequence. It's been handled. She'll get full credit, and there's a written apology going in her file. But I wanted you to know directly, and I wanted to apologize for my part in everything that led to your phone being disconnected so the school couldn't reach you. Marcus didn't soften his body language, still defensive, despite the apparent peace offering. You came here to tell me my daughter was okay and to apologize. That's unexpectedly considerate for someone who fired me yesterday. I didn't fire you. You resigned. But you're right that I created the conditions that made resignation your only viable option. Victoria felt the words catch in her throat, pride and guilt competing for dominance. I read the file. All of it. The intellectual property theft, the NDA, leveraging Maya's medical needs, the 3 years of systematic erasure. I was wrong about everything. Being wrong doesn't pay Maya's medical bills. It doesn't give me back the professional reputation Richard destroyed. It doesn't change that tomorrow I have to start looking for work that probably doesn't exist while trying to keep my daughter's health insurance from lapsing. Marcus's voice stayed controlled, but something underneath it trembled with suppressed emotion. The company's systems are failing. Major failures cascading through interconnected infrastructure that nobody else understands. We've got consultants trying to reverse engineer your architecture, but they're saying it could take weeks. Victoria paused, hating what she was about to ask, but seeing no alternative. I need you to come back. Temporarily. To fix what's breaking. The bitter laugh that escaped Marcus carried no humor whatsoever. You want me to save the company that's been stealing from me for 3 years. To help the CEO who couldn't be bothered to learn my name until she needed something. I want to make this right. I can't undo 3 years, but I can offer you real restitution. Full restoration of authorship credit for every project you created. Back pay for the salary difference between engineer and janitor. A formal position as Chief Technology Officer with equity compensation and protected status. Victoria spoke quickly, the words tumbling out before her courage failed. And if you help me prove Richard's guilt, I'll make sure he faces consequences. Criminal consequences if the evidence supports it. Why should I trust any of that? Marcus's skepticism was earned justified by 3 years of evidence that promises from people in power meant nothing, because the system's failures aren't random. Access logs show deliberate sabotage originating from Richard's department Tuesday night, right after you resigned. He's framing you for the damage while simultaneously trying to crash the stock price. Victoria pulled out her phone, showing Marcus the access log screenshots Sharon had provided. He's not just a thief, he's actively trying to destroy the company so he can acquire it at bankruptcy prices. Marcus studied the logs with the focus of someone whose professional training hadn't been erased by 3 years of janitorial work. These access patterns are sophisticated. He's triggering cascades that look like organic failures rather than deliberate attacks. That requires deep knowledge of the infrastructure architecture, knowledge he could only have from stealing your documentation. Victoria watched understanding move across Marcus's features. He's been planning this for months, maybe years, and you walking away gave him the perfect scapegoat. The door behind Marcus opened wider, revealing Maya in pajamas decorated with dinosaurs and planets. She studied Victoria with the frank assessment of children who haven't learned to hide their evaluations. Are you the lady who made Daddy sad? Victoria felt the question like a knife between her ribs, sharp and precise, and absolutely deserved. Yes, I'm very sorry about that. Maya considered this with visible seriousness. Can you do multiplication? The non sequitur threw Victoria completely. Yes. Then you can stay for dinner, but you have to help me with my homework, and if you're mean to my dad again, I'll tell everyone. Maya's tone suggested this was non-negotiable. The terms of provisional acceptance from someone who'd already learned to protect the people she loved. Richard Ashford's office occupied the corner of the executive floor, with windows facing south and east, the kind of real estate that communicated status within the company's unspoken hierarchy. His computer showed 3 monitors arranged in a configuration that suggested serious work happened. Here, data analysis and strategic planning, and the legitimate operations that camouflage criminal enterprise. The burner phone sat in his desk's bottom drawer, protected by a lock that security protocols should have prevented, but that Richard had circumvented through the same CFO override authority that had let him lock files and alter records and operate a parallel system of control for 3 years. The text message he composed used language carefully calibrated to sound like concern while carrying an unmistakable threat. Development at Lincoln Elementary requires your attention. Maya's academic performance attracting scrutiny. Recommend immediate intervention to avoid social services involvement. The message went to a number that would trace if anyone bothered to check to a prepaid phone purchased with cash at a convenience store in a neighborhood where security cameras had been broken for months. Richard had learned early in his criminal career that direct threats left evidence, but manufactured concern about a child's welfare could be explained away as misguided good intentions. Jessica Monroe's law office occupied 3 rooms above a Korean restaurant in a neighborhood where rent remained affordable because the commercial district hadn't yet been discovered by developers. The walls carried framed degrees from Georgetown Law and commendations from various corporate accountability organizations' credentials that established competence without requiring the marble and mahogany theater of downtown firms. Marcus sat across from her at a conference table covered in documents arranged in careful categories, each stack representing a different thread of evidence in the case they'd been building for 18 months. The investigation had started when Marcus reached out to a legal aid organization looking for advice on whether the NDA he'd signed was enforceable. That lawyer had referred him to Jessica, who'd seen in Marcus's story the outlines of something much larger than individual wrongdoing. The financial evidence occupied the table's left side bank records and wire transfers and corporate filings that showed $8.7 million moving through shell companies over 3 years. Jessica had obtained most of these records through legitimate discovery processes, minority shareholder rights that gave her access to company financials under the justification of evaluating fiduciary responsibility. The intellectual property theft documentation sat in the center, Marcus's original work on one side, and the plagiarized versions on the other, each pair time-stamped and digitally signed in ways that established clear chronology. The Predict AI system alone had generated $42 million in operational savings over 3 years' value that had been captured entirely by the company, while Marcus cleaned toilets for barely above minimum wage. The discrimination evidence filled the table's right side, 47 separate instances of minority employees being denied credit for their work, demoted without cause, or terminated under suspicious circumstances. Jessica had tracked down 38 of these former employees conducting interviews that revealed a pattern so consistent it ceased to be coincidence and became policy. We've got him on wire fraud securities, fraud intellectual property theft, and civil rights violations. Jessica's finger traced across the documents as she spoke, connecting evidence points like a prosecutor planning trial strategy. The embezzlement alone gets him federal prison time. Adding the IP theft and the discrimination pattern makes this a career-ending, reputation-destroying, asset-forfeiting conviction. Marcus studied the evidence with the expression of someone who'd spent 3 years documenting his own erasure and still couldn't quite believe the proof was real. What about Victoria? She enabled this through negligence, if not direct participation. Jessica shook her head, her assessment more nuanced than Marcus's anger would prefer. She's guilty of terrible leadership and willful blindness, but she's not criminally culpable. The evidence shows Richard actively concealed his operations from her, using his CFO authority to lock files and restrict access. She should have noticed, should have created systems that prevented this kind of abuse. But bad management isn't a crime. The school photo arrived via email Thursday afternoon, time-stamped 11:47 a.m., showing Maya leaving Lincoln Elementary's front entrance with her backpack and her gap-toothed smile. A second photo taken from a different angle showed her walking alone down Ashland Avenue, her small figure vulnerable in a way that made Marcus's vision narrow and his hands shake. The accompanying message contained no text, just the photos and the metadata showing they'd been taken that morning during the hours when Maya should have been safely inside the school building. The sender address was a string of random characters at a disposable email service, untraceable without law enforcement resources Marcus didn't have access to. He called Jessica immediately, his voice tight with the particular terror of a single parent whose child had been targeted. Someone photographed Maya, outside her school, this morning. Jessica's response came fast, and professional fear converted into action through training. Forward me everything, don't delete anything. We're documenting this as evidence of witness intimidation, which is a federal crime. Then we're calling the police and filing a report. The federal investigation had been running for 6 months before Marcus ever heard about it. The FBI building its case through financial records and informant testimony and the patient accumulation of evidence that characterized white-collar crime prosecution. Special Agent Catherine Williams had first contacted Jessica in October, looking for information about Richard Ashford's shell companies and their connection to a larger network of corporate fraud. What started as investigation into one company's embezzlement had expanded into something much larger. Richard's consulting firms had serviced 6 different company files across 4 states, each one showing the same pattern of intellectual property, theft targeting minority engineers, embezzlement through fake vendor contracts, and deliberate suppression of discrimination complaints. The total theft exceeded $43 million. The number of affected employees had reached 187. Jessica arranged the meeting for Friday evening in a conference room that the FBI had swept for surveillance devices, the paranoia warranted by Richard's demonstrated technical capabilities. Agent Williams arrived with 2 other investigators and a prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office, their presence transforming Marcus's individual grievance into a federal case. Mr. Brooks, we've been building this investigation for 6 months, but we're missing a crucial piece. The prosecutor, a woman named Andrea Reeves, spoke with the directness of someone whose time was valuable. We can prove the embezzlement, we can prove the shell companies, we can prove the pattern of theft across multiple jurisdictions. What we can't prove yet is Richard Ashford's personal involvement in the discrimination and IP theft. We need your testimony and your documentation. Marcus looked at Jessica, who nodded encouragement. Everything I've collected is yours. Code repositories, email chains, designed documents, the original and altered versions showing systematic plagiarism. I can testify to the threats, the coercion, the NDA that use my daughter's health as leverage. That's good, but we need more. We need you to go back. Agent Williams leaned forward, her intensity suggesting this was the crucial ask. Work with Victoria Sinclair. Give her access to your evidence. Let her think she's investigating Richard independently. When she discovers what he's done, she'll have to take action, and that action will create the public record we need for prosecution. The apartment felt different Saturday morning, occupied by people rather than just Marcus and Maya navigating survival. Victoria sat at the kitchen table helping Maya with multiplication tables, her expensive watch and designer clothes looking profoundly out of place among the second-hand furniture and bills held to the refrigerator with alphabet magnets. Jessica occupied the other chair reviewing legal documents and making notes in margins with the focus of someone for whom weekend work was normal. Marcus made coffee with the automatic movements of routine, his mind processing the previous day's revelations and Monday's coming confrontation. The federal investigation changed everything, transformed his personal grievance into institutional reckoning, but it also crystallized the risk. If Richard suspected what was coming, he had 72 hours to destroy evidence, move money, disappear into the kind of legal protection that wealth could buy. Maya's voice pulled him back to the present moment, her question directed at Victoria with the frank curiosity children deployed without social filter. Why did you fire my dad if he was good at his job? Victoria's expression showed genuine pain, the question cutting through professional distance to something more personal. I didn't know he was good at his job. I didn't know anything about him because I never bothered to look. But you're the boss. You're supposed to know. Maya's logic was 7-year-old simple, unencumbered by adult excuses about organizational complexity and delegation. You're absolutely right, I should have known. And because I didn't, I hurt your dad and I hurt you. I'm trying to fix that now, but some things can't be completely fixed, only made better than they were. Victoria met Maya's gaze directly, treating the child with the seriousness she deserved. Maya considered this for a long moment before returning to her multiplication of problems. Okay, but if you make Daddy sad again, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. The weight of that gentle threat hit harder than any professional consequence Victoria had ever faced. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability, the kind of day that had been building for 3 years through accumulated injustice and careful documentation. Marcus, dressed in the charcoal suit he'd worn to Marchand's, the same outfit that had triggered Victoria's jealous investigation and set this entire cascade in motion. Maya hugged him at the door with fierce intensity, her small arms tight around his waist. Love is bigger than the sky, Daddy. Her voice carried Sarah's words, the phrase that had sustained them through 4 years of grief and struggle and survival. Bigger than the sky, baby girl. Marcus held her close, breathing in the smell of her coconut shampoo and the particular sweetness of 7-year-old skin. When I come home tonight, things are going to be different. Good different. Maya pulled back to study his face, reading his expression with the practiced skill of a child who'd learned to interpret adult emotions. I hope so, but different either way. Marcus kissed her forehead and headed for the door where Jessica waited to drive them downtown. The company's executive floor felt different when Marcus arrived at 9:53 his presence there in a suit rather than maintenance uniform, causing visible confusion among the administrative staff who'd grown accustomed to his invisibility. David Sullivan appeared from his office, recognition and something like respect crossing his features. Marcus, it's good to see you back even under these circumstances. David's voice carried genuine warmth, the alliance between them forming through shared recognition of institutional wrong. The boardroom's glass doors stood open, directors filtering in with the casual authority of people who'd attended hundreds of similar meetings and expected this one to follow familiar patterns. Otis Brennan occupied his usual seat at the table's head. Richard Ashford sat to his right, expression calm and prepared, apparently unaware that federal agents were currently loading boxes of evidence from his shell company offices into government vehicles. Victoria stood at the presentation screen, her posture controlled in the way of someone about to detonate her own career for the possibility of doing something right. The last director entered at 9:58. Victoria closed the doors. Thank you all for coming on short notice. I've discovered evidence of systematic financial fraud, intellectual property theft, and civil rights violations occurring at the highest levels of this organization. The evidence suggests $8.7 million in embezzlement over 3 years executed by our chief financial officer. Victoria's voice stayed level professional, the careful neutrality of someone presenting data rather than accusations. Richard's expression shifted from calm to concern, the performance of a man wrongly accused but confident the truth would exonerate him. Those are extraordinary claims, Victoria. I assume you have extraordinary evidence. Before Victoria could respond, Marcus entered through the boardroom's side door, his presence causing heads to turn and expressions to shift from confusion to recognition to carefully masked surprise. He walked to the table's empty seat, set down his leather document folder, and looked directly at Otis Brennan. Article 7, Section 3 of the Corporate Bylaws grants any person with direct knowledge of fiduciary violations the right to address the board during emergency sessions. I have documentation of federal crimes committed by Richard Ashford over a period of 3 years. The FBI executed search warrants on his shell companies this morning at 9 a.m. You can verify this by calling Special Agent Catherine Williams, whose number I'm happy to provide. The silence that followed tasted like disaster. Richard's recovery took less than 5 seconds, the transition from surprise to calculated offense, smooth enough to reveal practice. This is highly irregular. Marcus Brooks was terminated for cause. His presence here violates. I resigned. Marcus kept his voice level, addressing the board rather than Richard. And my presence here is protected under whistleblower statutes which shield individuals reporting federal crimes from retaliation. You can verify this with the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is currently reviewing evidence I've provided over the past 18 months. Otis Brennan's expression shifted through confusion towards something that looked like controlled panic. The board wasn't notified of any federal investigation. That's because the investigation targeted this board's CFO and potentially implicated board members who failed to exercise proper oversight. Victoria moved to the projection screen, her hands steady despite the career-ending nature of what she was about to present. What Marcus is about to show you represents 3 years of systematic theft. I've conducted my own verification over the past 72 hours. The evidence is authentic. The first slide showed financial flows through Walsh Consulting, $8.7 million in transfers over 36 months. Each transaction corresponded to a falsified vendor invoice, services listed, but never rendered payments authorized through Richard's CFO credentials. The shell company's registration documents bore his wife's maiden name, the incorporation address a vacant lot in Delaware that existed only on paper. Richard's posture remained defensive but controlled. Those are legitimate consulting fees for specialized financial analysis. Walsh Consulting provides services this company lacks internal capacity for. Marcus pulled a document from his folder, the motion deliberate. Then you can explain why Walsh Consulting has filed 0 tax returns, employs no staff, maintains no office space, and shares a bank routing number with 2 other shell companies registered to offshore entities your wife controls through power of attorney. The specificity landed like artillery, each detail another breach in Richard's defensive position. One board member, a woman named Patricia Blackwell, who'd served for 6 years without apparent allegiance to Richard's faction, leaned forward. You have documentation of this. Marcus slid copies across the table, enough for each director. Bank statements obtained through legal discovery. Corporate registration documents showing the chain of ownership. Tax records, or rather the absence of them, provided by the IRS in response to a whistleblower complaint filed 9 months ago. The second slide showed intellectual property theft, Marcus's original work arranged beside the plagiarized versions that carried Finance Innovation Team authorship. The Predict AI system appeared in split-screen format, left side showing Marcus's GitHub repository from March 2021, right side showing the company's patent filing from June 2021. The code was identical down to comment syntax and variable naming conventions. Richard attempted deflection, his voice carrying manufactured patience. Design work done under employment contracts belongs to the employer. That's standard across the industry, except I didn't work in the finance department. Marcus advanced the slide to show his employment records. I was senior systems architect reporting to the chief technology officer, working under a contract that explicitly protected individual authorship rights for innovations outside my assigned duties. The Predict AI system was developed on my personal time using my own equipment. Your department had no involvement until you filed the patent application using stolen documentation. Marcus pulled out another document, its presence adding weight to his testimony. The original code contains my daughter's birth date as a random seed in line 2847, March 15, 2019. No one else would use that specific number. It's embedded in the source code I submitted in March 2021, 6 weeks before your department claimed to have created the system. The third slide showed the pattern extending beyond Marcus, 47 separate cases of minority engineers whose work had been systematically reassigned to white-presenting departments or credited to Richard's teams. Each case included original documentation, altered versions, and the demographic data showing that 100% of affected employees were Black, Hispanic, or Asian. This is a discrimination lawsuit waiting to happen. David Sullivan spoke for the first time, his operational mind recognizing institutional liability. We're looking at civil rights violations, hostile work environment claims, potential class action exposure in the tens of millions. It's already happening. Jessica Monroe's voice came from the doorway where she'd positioned herself as observer and legal counsel. I represent 47 current and former employees who filed complaints with the EEOC. The investigation has been ongoing for 8 months. This board has been operating under a consent decree for the past 6 weeks, which you should have been notified about, except that all correspondence went through the CFO's office. Otis Brennan's face had gone from pink to gray, the color of someone realizing their institutional protection was evaporating in real time. Richard, did you intercept federal communications directed at this board? The question hung unanswered because Richard had stopped performing cooperation. His expression had shifted from defensive to calculating, the look of someone running scenarios and finding no path forward that didn't end in destruction. The silence extended long enough to become confession through omission. The fourth slide showed the system's sabotage access logs, proving that Richard's credentials had been used to trigger the cascading failures that began Tuesday night, immediately after Marcus's resignation. The technical details were dense enough that most board members couldn't follow the specifics, but the timestamp correlation was clear. Marcus left the building at 5:47 p.m. Richard accessed critical infrastructure systems at 11:47 p.m. System failures began propagating at 12:03 a.m. You tried to crash the company's stock price. Victoria spoke with the tone of someone watching their own judgment being validated through evidence. The plan was to create enough operational chaos that shareholders would panic sell, driving valuations down far enough that your shell companies could acquire controlling interest at bankruptcy prices. Richard finally found his voice, but the reasonable concern had been replaced by barely controlled fury. This is conspiracy theory nonsense constructed by a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. You're destroying this company's credibility based on circumstantial evidence and the word of someone who's been out of touch with technical operations for 3 years. Marcus stood his posture, carrying authority that 3 years of janitorial work hadn't diminished. I've been maintaining those technical operations for 3 years. Every system that runs this company I designed or rebuilt. The cooling redundancy you claimed was a random failure. I documented the deferred maintenance you authorized to cut costs. The elevator that trapped executives, I manually released it because your efficiency measures eliminated proper training. The presentation that saved the Japanese contract, I crawled behind the stage and bypassed equipment you refused to replace. The board members were looking at Marcus differently now. Professional competence, rewriting their assumptions about what a maintenance technician might be capable of understanding. Patricia Blackwell's question came carefully. Can you prove these interventions? Marcus pulled out another document, set this one showing maintenance logs with his detailed technical notes. Each entry included timestamp, problem description, solution implemented, and recommendation for permanent fix. The recommendations, systematically marked as reviewed and deferred, all carried Richard Ashford's digital signature. You knew the infrastructure was degrading. You chose not to fix it because failures served your purpose. Marcus's voice stayed quiet, but something underneath it burned with 3 years of suppressed rage. You built a company crisis through intentional negligence, then positioned yourself to profit from the disaster you created. The silence that followed felt like the moment before structures collapse, all the weight concentrated on failure points that could no longer hold. Richard's phone buzzed with incoming messages, probably alerts about the federal raids happening across town, the boxes of evidence being loaded into government vehicles, the shell company offices being locked down by agents with search warrants. The door opened again, this time admitting Special Agent Catherine Williams with 2 other federal officers. Their presence transformed the corporate meeting into something else entirely, the boundary between white-collar propriety and criminal consequences dissolving with the display of badges and credentials. Richard Ashford, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, securities, fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Agent Williams's voice carried no drama, just the procedural efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. Richard's calculation finally reached the conclusion it had been avoiding. This is absurd. I'm calling my attorney. You should do that. Williams stepped aside to let her colleagues move forward with handcuffs. You can make that call from federal detention. The processing facility has phones available once you've been booked. The handcuffs clicking shut made a sound like finality, like 3 years of careful construction meeting its designed endpoint. Richard's expression cycled through disbelief, fury, and something that might have been fear before settling on a blank professionalism, the mask of someone who'd learned that showing emotion created vulnerability. You're making a mistake. Richard directed this at Victoria, his voice tight with controlled rage. I saved this company. The innovations credited to my department generated millions in value. When the board reviews actual performance metrics rather than this fabricated narrative, you'll understand what you've lost. I've lost a criminal who used my company as a personal bank account. Victoria's response came without hesitation, the authority in her voice suggesting she'd finally stepped into the role she'd been occupying without fully inhabiting. Security will escort you to process your personal effects under supervision. Your access to all company systems is revoked, effective immediately. The federal agents led Richard toward the door, his exit through the boardroom carrying none of the dignity he'd spent years cultivating. The directors sat in shocked silence, their faces showing various stages of processing what had just happened and what it meant for their own positions. Patricia Blackwell recovered first, her question directed at Victoria. How deep does this go? How many of us knew? That's what the independent investigation will determine. Victoria's tone suggested she already had opinions, but was choosing institutional process over immediate purge. The FBI has provided me with preliminary evidence suggesting 3 board members received payments from Richard's shell companies. Those individuals will be asked to resign today. The remaining board will cooperate fully with federal investigators or face obstruction charges. 2 directors stood simultaneously, their movement coordinated in the way of people who'd been communicating outside official channels. Gerald Foster and Martin Hayes, both serving for less than 2 years, both recruited during Richard's tenure through processes that hadn't involved the full board. Their departure came without words, just the recognition that resistance would only compound their liability. Otis Brennan remained seated, his hands flat on the table in front of him. I received consulting payments, 18 months of monthly fees totaling $120,000. I believe they were legitimate compensation for strategic advice Richard requested on market positioning. That's called bribery, when it involves board votes on financial matters. Jessica Monroe's question came sharp and precise, her professional assessment carrying no judgment, just the factual observation of someone cataloging crimes. You'll need to retain counsel, probably criminal counsel, not just civil. Otis stood with the defeated posture of someone whose career had just ended. I'll tender my resignation, effective immediately. The exodus left 4 directors remaining: Patricia Blackwell, David Sullivan, who'd attended as COO but held a board seat, and 2 others who'd maintained independence from Richard's faction. The depleted board represented barely enough members to form a quorum, institutional continuity preserved by the narrowest margin. We need to address immediate operational concerns. Patricia assumed leadership through necessity rather than formal process. The system's failures, the federal investigation, the media exposure that's about to hit when news of Richard's arrest breaks. Who's running this company through the crisis? Victoria looked at Marcus. Recognition and something like respect visible in her expression. Marcus, we need you as Chief Technology Officer, effective immediately. The position comes with equity, compensation, full authority over technical operations, and a seat at this table for any decisions affecting infrastructure or security. Marcus had spent 3 years being invisible, being dismissed, being systematically erased from the professional identity he'd built. The offer represented vindication and opportunity and the chance to rebuild on his terms. But his response surprised everyone, including himself. "I'll take the CTO position on 3 conditions. First, we establish a fund to compensate the 47 employees whose work was stolen. Not just back pay, but punitive damages that acknowledge the theft of professional reputation and career advancement. Second, we implement mandatory bias training for all executives and managers conducted by external consultants with enforcement mechanisms, including termination for non-compliance. Third, Maya gets to approve my schedule, and if she says I need to be at her science fair or her school play, that takes precedence over board meetings." The final condition landed with the weight of personal priority asserting itself over corporate demands, a black father declaring that his daughter's needs would not be subordinated to institutional convenience. The board members exchanged glances, processing the audacity of a newly appointed executive, making structural demands before accepting his position. Patricia's smile appeared slowly. "Those conditions are acceptable. I'll add a fourth: you get veto authority over any technical or infrastructure decisions regardless of financial implications. We've just learned what happens when engineering expertise gets overruled by cost-cutting." The agreement passed through nods and verbal confirmations. Corporate governance adapting to accommodate the reality that Marcus now held knowledge and authority the company couldn't function without. The press conference happened at 2 p.m. Victoria, standing at a podium in the company's main lobby, with Marcus and David flanking her, the visual composition suggesting solidarity rather than hierarchy. News cameras filled the space where corporate art usually dominated the journalists' questions, coming fast and aggressive, scenting blood in the institutional water. This morning, federal agents arrested our chief financial officer on charges of wire fraud, securities, fraud, and conspiracy. I've learned that Richard Ashford operated a systematic scheme to embezzle company funds and steal intellectual property over a 3-year period. Victoria's voice stayed controlled, her professional composure maintained through what had to be one of the worst days of her career. "I take full responsibility for failing to detect these crimes. As CEO, I should have implemented oversight mechanisms that prevented this abuse." The question came from a reporter in the front row, her tone sharp with skepticism. "You're saying you had no knowledge of $8.7 million in missing funds?" "I had no knowledge because our CFO actively concealed the theft through falsified documentation and abuse of system access. But ignorance is not innocence. I failed in my duty to create transparent accountability structures. That failure enabled Richard Ashford's crimes and hurt dozens of employees whose work was stolen." Victoria paused, meeting the cameras directly. "I'm implementing immediate reforms, independent auditing of all financial operations, anonymous reporting systems for employees to flag concerns without retaliation, and restoration of intellectual property credit to the actual creators. We're also establishing a $5 million fund to compensate affected employees." Another reporter, this one male with the aggressive posture of someone who'd covered corporate scandals before. "Why should shareholders believe you're capable of leading this company through crisis when you didn't notice a massive fraud happening under your leadership? Because the person who discovered the fraud is now our chief technology officer." Victoria gestured toward Marcus. Marcus Brooks spent 3 years documenting these crimes while working in a position far below his capabilities. He's the one who brought evidence to federal investigators. He's the one who built the systems that kept this company running while it was being stolen from the inside. And he's the one who's going to help rebuild an institutional culture where competence gets recognized regardless of who demonstrates it. The camera focus shifted to Marcus journalists, recognizing a more compelling story than disgraced CEO. "Mr. Brooks, you went from senior engineer to night janitor. Why did you stay?" "My daughter has a chronic medical condition that requires consistent treatment and monitoring. Leaving meant losing her health insurance, which meant choosing between my professional dignity and her medical care." Marcus spoke with quiet clarity, the personal story carrying more impact than corporate abstractions. "I stayed because I'm a father first and an engineer second. But I documented everything because staying silent meant accepting that the system was designed to exploit exactly that kind of vulnerability." The quote would lead every news broadcast that evening, the soundbite perfect in its balance of personal vulnerability and systemic critique. Social media picked it up within minutes, the narrative of invisible worker, vindicating himself against corporate theft resonating across demographic lines. The Department of Justice investigation concluded 6 months later with a consent decree that would govern company operations for 7 years. The terms required annual independent audits, diversity hiring targets enforced through financial penalties or for non-compliance anonymous reporting systems, with third-party oversight and mandatory bias training for all employees in supervisory roles. The class action settlement on behalf of 47 affected employees totaled $23 million, individual payments ranging from $300,000 to $1.2 million depending on duration of employment and extent of stolen work. Marcus's settlement came to $870,000 after legal fees. Money he invested in a college fund for Maya and a scholarship program for children of single parents pursuing STEM education. Richard Ashford's trial proceeded through federal court with the grinding slowness that characterized white-collar crime prosecution, delays in motions and plea negotiations stretching across 14 months before resolution. The final plea agreement involved guilty pleas to 12 counts of wire fraud and 6 counts of securities fraud in exchange for dismissal of the remaining charges. The sentence, 14 months federal prison, 3 years supervised release, restitution of $8.7 million and permanent prohibition from serving as officer or director of any publicly traded company. The company's transformation proceeded through the systematic implementation of reforms that would have seemed radical 3 years earlier, but now represented basic institutional hygiene. The anonymous reporting system received 43 submissions in its first month, everything from sexual harassment complaints to safety violations to concerns about financial irregularities. Each report triggered investigation protocols that bypassed individual managers and went directly to independent auditors. The diversity hiring initiative brought measurable change to company demographics, leadership positions shifting from 92% white male to 63% over 18 months. Marcus navigated between perspectives as CTO, his personal experience providing credibility with affected employees, while his technical authority gave him standing with resistant managers. The relationship between Marcus and Victoria developed through the slow accumulation of shared experience rather than dramatic romantic gestures. They attended Maya's school events together, navigated board meetings as partners, argued about technical decisions with the comfort of people who'd learned to disagree without threatening the relationship's foundation. The first kiss happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, Maya asleep in her room while Marcus and Victoria reviewed strategic planning documents at his kitchen table. The moment arrived without orchestration, just the natural progression of two people who'd been circling closer for months, finally closing the remaining distance. "I don't want to rush this." Victoria spoke quietly, her forehead resting against Marcus's, her breath warm against his skin. "Maya needs stability more than I need momentum. Maya needs to see that the world can be good to her father, that people can change, that trust can be rebuilt after it's broken." Marcus kissed her again, soft and unhurried, claiming space for joy without apology. "And I need to remember how to be more than just a father and an engineer. Sarah would tell me, I'm allowed to build a life that includes happiness." The grief in his voice wasn't sharp anymore, just the acknowledgement of loss that would always be present, but didn't have to prevent future growth. Victoria understood because she'd learned over 18 months that healing wasn't about erasing damage, but about building new structures that could accommodate both the scars and the possibility of better things. The science fair occupied Lincoln Elementary's gymnasium on a Thursday evening. The space transformed into rows of student projects with the organized chaos of childhood scientific inquiry. Maya's display occupied position 17 in the third row, her poster board decorated with hand-drawn diagrams explaining how computer systems learn from mistakes. The title read, "Teaching Machines to Think How My Dad's Code Learns to Fix Itself," in careful marker lettering. The content below described machine learning principles through the metaphor of the Predict AI system, explaining how computers could identify patterns in equipment failures and implement preventive maintenance before problems occurred. Marcus stood beside Maya's display with pride, sharp enough to hurt, watching his daughter explain her project to judges with confidence that 7-year-olds shouldn't possess, but that children who'd survived harder things than their years somehow developed anyway. Victoria arrived during the final judging round, her presence causing several parent heads to turn in recognition from the news coverage that had dominated local media for 3 weeks. She carried flowers for Maya, an age-appropriate bouquet of daisies and sunflowers that suggested she'd consulted someone about what 7-year-olds would appreciate. The judges announced results at 7:30, awards distributed through categories designed to let every child feel successful while still recognizing exceptional work. Maya won first place in her age group for scientific innovation, the blue ribbon pinned to her poster board, generating a smile that justified every decision Marcus had made over 3 years of invisible suffering. The beach trip happened on a Saturday in late summer, Maya's request for vacation destination, after finishing third grade with straight A's and perfect attendance. The three of them, Marcus, Maya, Victoria, occupied a blanket on sand that stretched toward ocean waves, breaking in rhythmic patterns that suggested permanence despite constant motion. Maya built sandcastles with engineering precision, her structures incorporating principles of weight distribution and foundation stability that she'd absorbed through proximity to technical conversations. Victoria helped with the moat system, digging channels that would funnel water without undermining the walls. Marcus watched them work together, his chest tight with emotions he'd spent 3 years suppressing and 18 months learning to feel again. The thought arrived fully formed: this is what redemption looks like. Not revenge, not even justice in the courtroom sense, but the building of something good from the wreckage of what was broken. You're thinking profound thoughts. Victoria nudged his shoulder with hers, her bare feet buried in sand, her professional armor completely abandoned in favor of shorts and a t-shirt that suggested she'd learned the difference between being strong and being untouchable. Thinking that Maya's going to change the world someday. That we're raising someone who'll build systems that don't require people to be invisible to survive. Marcus pulled his daughter close when she abandoned her castle to lean against him. Thinking that being seen is different from being visible. You can be visible and still invisible to people who choose not to look. But once people see you, really see you, they can't go back to not knowing. Victoria spoke with the certainty of someone who'd experienced that transformation from the inside. You changed how I understand leadership, power, responsibility. You changed how I see myself. Maya looked up at both of them with the frank assessment children deployed when adults were being sentimental. Are you guys going to get married? The question hung in the salt air between them, innocent and profound in the way children's questions often were. Marcus and Victoria exchanged glances. Communication happening through looks that didn't require words. Maybe someday. Marcus kissed the top of Maya's head, her hair smelling of sunscreen and ocean spray. When we're all ready, when it feels right for everyone, not just the grown-ups, I'm ready. You guys are just slow. Maya pulled free to return to her sandcastle, her declaration delivered with the confidence of 9-year-old certainty. The ocean continued its rhythm waves, building and breaking and building again, the pattern suggesting that endings were also beginnings, that systems collapsed to make space for better structures, that the work of building justice was never finished but always worth continuing. Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from Jessica. Appeal court upheld the consent decree. 7 years of federal oversight confirmed. Richard's appeal for sentence reduction denied. This is permanent. The news felt like closing a book whose ending had been written months ago but needed official confirmation. Marcus showed the message to Victoria, who nodded with the satisfaction of someone who'd fought for institutional change and seen it achieve sustainable form. They stayed at the beach until sunset painted the sky in colors. Maya insisted they name persimmon, orange, lavender, purple, the particular pink that existed only in summer evening light. The drive home happened in comfortable silence, Maya asleep in the back seat, her gap-toothed smile visible in the rearview mirror. The house Marcus had lived in for 7 years had been replaced 6 months earlier by a home in a neighborhood where property values reflected investment rather than neglect, where Maya's school had adequate resources and teachers who didn't assume incompetence based on demographics. Victoria had contributed to the down payment, not as charity, but as partner, their relationship having progressed past the point where pride prevented practical support. The house had a yard where Maya could play, and a garage where Marcus could work on personal projects, and enough bedrooms that Victoria could maintain her own space when she stayed over, which was increasingly most nights. The walls held photos of Sarah alongside newer pictures of the expanding family they were becoming, grief and hope coexisting without contradiction. Marcus carried Maya to her bedroom, tucking her in with practiced efficiency, despite her sleepy protests that she wasn't tired. The ritual included the same words every night, Sarah's gift that had sustained them through 4 years of survival and 2 years of rebuilding. Love is bigger than the sky, baby girl. His voice barely above whispers, soft enough not to wake her fully, but clear enough to register in whatever dreams 9-year-olds had. Bigger than the sky, daddy. Maya's response automatic and drowsy, the phrase embedded so deep it required no conscious thought. Victoria waited in the hallway, her presence now familiar enough to feel like home rather than guest. They moved to the kitchen where coffee waited and tomorrow's work loomed, but neither felt urgent compared to the quiet satisfaction of the present moment. Did you ever imagine this? Victoria gestured at the house, at the life they'd built from the ruins of institutional failure. Not the specific details, but the general shape of things working out. Marcus considered the question, honestly remembering the man he'd been 3 years ago, cleaning toilets at midnight while his daughter slept and his professional identity dissolved. No, I imagine survival. I imagine keeping Maya healthy and safe. I imagine documenting crimes and maybe someday getting justice. I didn't imagine belonging somewhere or being valued for what I could do or building something with someone who chose to see me. The last part landed with the weight of recognition, the acknowledgement that Victoria's transformation from willful blindness to genuine sight represented its own form of courage. She could have maintained comfortable denial. She could have sided with Richard and preserved institutional continuity. She chose difficulty, instead chose accountability over comfort, chose to dismantle the structures that had elevated her at others' expense. I'm glad you're slow to forgive. Victoria spoke after silence had stretched long enough to feel comfortable rather than awkward. Easy forgiveness would have meant you didn't take the harm seriously. Making me earn back trust, making me prove change through sustained action, that's the only path that leads anywhere real. They sat together in the kitchen where bills no longer dominated the counter, where Maya's artwork covered the refrigerator, where the coffee was good and the future felt possible. The work of institutional transformation would continue tomorrow and the day after and for years to come. But tonight, the work of being human together was enough. The story that had begun with invisibility and theft and the systematic erasure of human dignity ended here in a kitchen where a Black father and a CEO who'd learned to see beyond her privilege drank coffee and planned tomorrow, while a 9-year-old dreamed dreams bigger than the sky in a world that was still broken, but slightly less broken than before, in the knowledge that change happened through the patient work of building better systems one decision at a time.